Good morning. This is a experiment to see if I'm really upside down or right side up. Good morning. This is the third tape for the third testing period. It's been a while since we've had a voice to be able to talk, but it's good to be back and to feel reasonably healthy again, although it's a hard way to lose weight, to lose 10 pounds in about 10 days, to get as sick as I was, but we're back. We want to talk this morning and continue our discussion about Texas at the turn of the 20th century. Women, particularly, address the issue of women this morning. Women enjoyed more rights in Texas at the turn of the 20th century than women in most states, but the truth is that females remained less equal in rights than men. Texas women at the turn of the 20th century couldn't vote. They were limited in business opportunities, despite a Texas heritage of Spanish civil law where women could hold property, make contracts, and be engaged in litigation. Single women generally retained more rights than married women who lost their individuality under the institution of marriage. By 1890, female students, K through 12 grades in Texas, outnumbered males, but few women attended colleges to learn anything more than just the basics, the social graces, or to study the arts. It was said that women who went to college at the turn of the 20th century was looking for their MRS degree. In other words, to find a husband, a suitable husband. By 1890, 8% of Texas women worked outside the home, while 50% of these worked in agriculture, and the next largest group in domestic services, i.e. as maids or servants in someone else's home. The remainder were in the traditional female occupations of teaching, nursing, librarians, merchants, seamstresses, etc. But the 1890 census in Texas had 2 women who alleged to be locomotive engineers. So it was a slow process for women breaking into the professions. One particular different group of women in Belton, Texas, were referred to as the sanctificationist of Martha McWhirter, M-C-H-W-H-I-R-T-E-R, Martha McWhirter, who believed in living free without male domination or support. This group of women operated a hotel and prospered in Belton, Texas. And in 1889, the group sold their Texas property and they moved to Washington, D.C., where they attempted to continue the sanctificationist activity. By 1900, approximately 25% of Texans were black and 5% Hispanic. In other words, about 25% of the state was minority, traditional minorities, Hispanic and black, with blacks making up 20% of the population. Approximately 90% of Texas blacks lived in the eastern parts of the state, where slavery and plantation culture existed before the Civil War, and 80% of blacks by 1900 still worked in agriculture. Most rural blacks were cotton farmers, with only 25% of blacks owning their own land, 75% sharecropping. Urban blacks constituted 25% of the non-farm workers in Texas by 1900, but domestic and personal services accounted for 80% of the black urban workers. About 5% of black urban workers entered the occupations, and by 1900, Texas had 136 black physicians, the largest number of black doctors in the nation. Yet few blacks were craftsmen. Wages for black workers were low, and few blacks owned their own businesses. Usually, black entrepreneurs were limited to small groceries, restaurants, taverns, and blacksmiths that confined their services to black customers. Black education was inadequate, with Texas ranked 5th among the southern states in the number of blacks enrolled in school and 3rd in the number of black teachers by 1900. Often whites were disinterested or openly unsympathetic to civil rights of Negroes. School appropriations, in theory equal due to Plessy versus Ferguson, the national ruling of the Supreme Court that said separate but equal facilities were acceptable under the law. For blacks, in theory, despite Plessy versus Ferguson, school appropriations were inadequate, with only 19 black high schools existing in the entire state of Texas by 1900. Regression and progress marked the black race. Texas blacks became increasingly poor and their mortality rates increased. Segregation and violence continued. From 1882 to 1903, 21 years, 199 Texas blacks were lynched. From 1903 to 1927, 171 additional blacks fell prey to what was called Judge Lynch. All it took was for a black man to insult a white person, particularly a white woman, and have to face the wrath of Judge Lynch. Black organizations were begun in Texas, and the first chapter of the NAACP in Texas was begun in Houston in 1912. Mexican or Hispanic Texans, Tejanos, numbered approximately 125,000 in 1900 and 164,000 by 1910. Hispanics were located primarily in South Texas, West Texas, and in the border counties along Mexico, the Mexican border. The Mexican Revolution in Mexico heightened the number of immigrants coming into Texas by 1910. Prejudice, poverty, discrimination were common problems of Hispanics, and indeed, if blacks were discriminated against, so too were Hispanics. Indeed, sometimes no Mexican Americans or dogs allowed signs were prominent in businesses in Texas by the turn of the 20th century. Separated into separate living areas called euphemistically Little Mexicos, Tejanos found low pay and physically tiring jobs. School discrimination was allowed. Schools would not allow Hispanics to be spoken in the public schools, and that worked against Hispanic culture and heritage, home life, and the Spanish language. Tejanos often formed mutualistas, organizations that raised funds to aid their fellow Hispanics and preserve the Tejano heritage within Texas. Political participation by Hispanics from 1865 to 1900 was limited, with only 3 Tejano Hispanic state legislators elected. The most significant, perhaps, was Santos Benavides, the former mayor of Laredo and a former brigadier general of the Confederate States of America. The South Texas vote was often controlled by political bosses such as Manuel Guerra of Rio Grande City of Starr County, and often the South Texas vote went for sale to the highest bidder. For instance, in 1924, Mrs. Ferguson won 90% of the South Texas vote, but in 1926, 2 years later, she lost 90% of the South Texas vote. Obviously, Governor Moody, in his attempt to gain the governorship over Mrs. Ferguson, paid more for the South Texas vote, and so the South Texas vote went for Moody, whereas it had gone for Ferguson in 1924. Rarely political activity occurred to assist Tejanos, but there were cases in point. When San Pedro Park in San Antonio was closed to Hispanics in the 1880s, Hispanic protests forced its reopening. Hispanic unions participated in successful San Antonio streetcar strike in 1901 a coal mining strike in 1903, and a Texas railroad strike in 1906. Other ethnic Europeans who migrated to Texas included Germans, Czechs, Poles, and Scandinavians. By 1900, 50,000 Texas residents had been born in Germany. Scattered in cultural folk islands across Texas, such as New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, Comfort, etc. These Germans retained their heritage to a great degree. In fact, until the early 1960s and early 70s, one could walk the streets of Fredericksburg and hear German being spoken. The Texas Institute of Cultures today celebrates approximately 20 to 25 cultures that blended into Texas, creating a pluralistic society and state. Literature and arts at the turn of the 20th century flourished. The best literary works, largely related to Texas past, such as Noah Smithwick's The Evolution of the State in 1900, John Duvall's The Early Times in Texas, Francis Lubbock's 6 Decades in Texas, and John Reagan's Memoirs. But also, there was J.W. Wilbarger's Texas Indian Depredations in Texas, James DeShields' Border Wars of Texas, and Charlie Sirenko's Texas Cowboy. Fiction efforts included Sam Dixon's edited Poets and Poetry of Texas, published in 1905, Francis Allen's Lone Star Ballads, and the works of William Sidney Porter, more commonly known as the writer O. Henry, who lived in Austin, Texas for a while. Texas literary historical movement was greatly aided in 1897 with the organization of the Texas State Historical Association under William Garrison, Eugene Bolton, Eugene Barker, Charles Ramsdale, and others. Best known Texas artist at this time was H.A. McCardle and William Huddle, whose oil paintings of the Texas Revolution hang in the state capitol even today. In sculpture, Elizabeth Ney was supreme. Migrating from Bavaria in 1870, where she had already sculpted most of Europe's aristocracy, Ney settled outside of Austin, where she sculpted statues of Austin, Houston, Albert Sidney Johnston, and others. Her works reside in many of the great museums of America. Music would also flourish under Carl Vinth, emerging Tejano Hispanic music, and jazz through Texas-born Scott Joplin, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and Huddy Ledbelly Ledbetter. So in fact, there was some progress and growth in Texas by the turn of the 20th century. But what we need to do now is to talk about the progressive movement in America, in Texas, because the progressive movement came to Texas in the turn of the 20th century. From 1901 to 1920, that period of time is referred to as the Progressive Era. Middle-class urban professionals joined agrarian and rural social reformers interested in economic development. These Texas progressives wished to have good government, improved rural life, regulation of corporations, the purification of society through prohibition and prison reform, expanded suffrage for all Texans, and educational changes. Education and a more efficient business bureaucracy through boards and commissions could help to attain these goals. But Southern and Texas progressivism aimed for a whites-only society. So sadly, many Texas progressives could also be race baiters, and they saw no hypocrisy on the one hand of advocating for progressivism for whites, but denying those progressive reforms to blacks. Texas progressivism was anti-Eastern, anti-Northern, and they regarded government regulation as a way to free Texas from northern and eastern financial interests. In the early years, despite Governor Sayer and S.W.T. Lanham's conservatism, the Texas legislature enacted some very progressive reforms. The 1902 poll tax bill served as a method of voter registration, making election day fraud more difficult. And in 1905, the Terrell election law required all political parties receiving a minimum of 100,000 votes in a statewide election to adopt primaries as nominating devices in the next election. The law also required statement of campaign expenditures for both primaries and for the general election. Yet the poll tax no doubt disenfranchised minorities and the poor. Other progressive laws exempted labor unions from antitrust legislation, outlawed blacklists, and the regulation of child labor. Texas banking and tax laws, tax reform were also passed, and the legislature created a commission for insurance and banking and initiated a constitutional amendment allowing for the rechartering of Texas state banks. Progressives believed in restoring competition and therefore supported antitrust legislation. In 1917, Texas state attorney generals prosecuted over 100 companies for violating state antitrust legislation. The Waters-Pierce case, in which the company forfeited its Texas charter because it was controlled by Standard Oil of New Jersey in 1902 and 1903. When that happened, Waters-Pierce appealed to United States Senator Joseph Bailey, who convinced the Texas Attorney General to readmit the company. In 1904, it had been rejected and forced out of Texas in 1902. And Waters-Pierce was allowed back into Texas to do business in 1904, now supposedly void of all connections with Standard Oil. However, in 1905, the state of Missouri also investigated Waters-Pierce, and while investigating Waters-Pierce in 1905, the state of Missouri discovered that Standard Oil still owned 3,000 shares in Waters-Pierce. In 1906, new Texas Attorney General Robert Davidson prosecuted Waters-Pierce, ousting it once again from Texas and forcing a $1.8 million fine on the company. Conflicts of interest charges were levied by his opponents at Senator Bailey, who vigorously denied the charges and who was reelected to the United States Senate in 1907. In 1908, Bailey also sought to control the Texas delegation to the National Democratic Convention, but he failed. Despite Bailey's candidate, Oscar Colquitt, gaining the 1910 Texas Democratic gubernatorial nomination over Tyler's Cone Johnson, an anti-Bailey candidate, Bailey lost touch with Texas progressives, and eventually he retired in January of 1913. He came out of retirement in 1920 but lost the Democratic nomination for governor to Pat Neff of Waco. Oscar Colquitt was a Bailey man and an opponent. He was a wet who was an opponent of Prohibition. Oscar Colquitt became governor in 1910. He was decidedly conservative. He frowned on free textbooks in public schools, and he denounced direct democracy as socialistic, quote unquote, socialistic and un-American, end quote. Yet some reform did occur, including the first workmen's compensation bill ever to be passed in the state of Texas. During Colquitt's administration, the Mexican Revolution made for many problems along the Texas-Mexican border. The revolutionists in Mexico used the Texas side to further the revolution, raising money and supplies, raiding Texas ranches, sabotaging Texas railroads, etc. Governor Colquitt condemned both the Taft and the Wilson administration for their tentativeness even after United States troops were eventually sent to the Mexican border. Colquitt ordered the Texas Rangers, 1,000 of them twice, into the Rio Grande Valley. Charges of maltreatment of Hispanics, South Texas Hispanics, led to a 1919 Texas law reducing the Texas Rangers to just 4 companies of 17 men each. Texas progressives who favored Wilson quickly turned away from Colquitt by 1912. Financially, the state of Texas suffered as Colquitt inherited an annual $1 million deficit. Rising costs of living, new state buildings, a destructive fire at Texas A&M, and an antiquated prison system caused many heavy outlays of state money. By his second administration, 1912-1914, Colquitt had to advocate raising the state tax rate since state expenditures continued to climb, more than doubling from 1903 to 1914. But during this time, Prohibition was the key issue in the state of Texas. As Prohibitionists organized in 1900, the Texas Brewers Association that supported the continuance of alcohol in Texas raised more than $2 million by assessing its members. Yet Prohibitionists, the Dries, made gains. As they had driven most saloons out of North and West Texas in the 1890s, the Dries made progress in the next decade in South and Southeast Texas. But by 1910, the anti-wet Prohibitionist Dries rallied behind Colquitt's election, and in 1911, Texans voted on a constitutional amendment to outlaw the consumption of alcohol in Texas. But the effort failed, 231,000 to 237,000 against. In other words, that vote was 49.32% for against 50.68% against ending the consumption of alcohol in Texas. Suits filed by Attorney General B.F. Looney in 1915 revealed that the brewers had consistently violated state antitrust laws and illegally used funds in political elections. And in 1917, Governor James Ferguson would be impeached and removed in part for accepting a huge $156,000 quote-unquote loan from the Brewers Association, which he certainly never paid back. World War I brought further drinking restrictions, and in 1919, a federal law on prohibition went into effect. Texas ratified the 18th Amendment, which outlawed consumption of alcohol, 188,000 to 130,000 against in 1919. One other aspect that we want to cover today is prison reform. Prison reform was badly needed in the state of Texas. Prisoners were overworked, underfed, they were not segregated by sex or age, and they suffered from poor health and sanitation. While phasing out the contract lease system by 1912 and restricting whipping, more reform was needed. But most citizens believed that prisons should be self-supporting. That occurred on state-run farms in good crop years, but not in drought years. Monetary deficits and claims of mismanagement continued right up through 1925. So in 1927, the legislature created the Texas Prison Board and temporarily removed the prisons from controversy. The electric chair began to be used in 1923, Old Sparky, and juvenile facilities for offenders were created, especially, and as an example, a facility for black females was created in the 1920s. Texas progressives created a state medical board, a state Department of Health, and a state board of control, exercising authority over blind schools, tubercular institutes such as Kerrville's State Hospital, state homes for dependent children, and orphans' homes. Yet these facilities were underfunded and overcrowded. As late as 1929, some mentally ill remained confined to jails, as was the case in Austin, Texas, that I discovered doing my master's thesis in 1876. So in some places in Texas, reform for the mentally ill simply didn't go into effect until as late as 1929. So we want to stop at this point and try to put this into the clouds. And when we come in next time, we'll talk about two other issues that concern Texas during this progressive era. Conservation of East Texas forests and the development of good roads were fundamental to the progressive movement, and we'll talk about that next time. But for now, I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Have a good day, and I'll see you later.